Azimuth had the Galvan doctors bandage up Ben as best they could given the circumstances, and Ben tells them that Gwen is going to kill him. The first thinker told Ben that they would need to get off-world to go after Vilgax, but none of the Galvan vessels were large enough to handle it. Ben coughs and says to contact Galvan B, as his team was currently there. Nodding, Azimuth then proceeds to do just that. When they'd landed down at where they were told to, Gwen stormed out of ship, really angry because of how stupid Ben was to keep them from joining in the battle, and began to go off about how dare he, but was cut off when she'd seen his injuries and ran over, her rage all but forgotten, and now was more worried than anything. Ben coughs and jokes, telling Gwen to make it quick if she's going to kill him, and she tells him to stop, asking what happened. And Azimuth tells her the truth of the situation, how Vilgax had grabbed Ben using a small cloaking device that broke after use, how he'd broken Ben's arm and stomped his side and kicked him because he refused to let go of the Omnitrix and give in to the tyrant's demands. Azimuth tells them that he does have a plan and that they would need to finish his work on something immediately before they could leave. Ben says whatever it was, they can finish it on the way there. It seemed the pain suppressants had started to take effect, and he'd ask Gwen to help with her magic, though she says she can't do much for healing, but she'd do what she could. While Gwen was using her magic to help Ben heal as best she could, Ben says that he wanted to apologize for, but she cut him off, telling him he can apologize for being a jerk later. Right now, he just needed to get better, to which he'd nodded, as they'd gotten everyone and all of the stuff Azimuth needed onto ship and headed on off. They asked the Galvan what the plan was, and he continued working on the new device, getting it just about ready. He then tells them that one of them will be chosen to wield this new device to take down Vilgax. Ben immediately says that he'd be the one to take down that monster, prompting Azimuth to stop and look at them just as the dial had lit up on completion. He turns to Ben and says that he is still injured and would not be risking his life. Then calls out to Plumber Agent Levin, though he was immediately cut off by Kevin, who says not a chance in hell. There's only one person aboard ship worthy to have that new device. Lucy also agrees with Kevin, as does Gwen, sighing Azimuth called them foolish children and says that if he must, he would wield it himself, though when he turned back to the table, the device was gone. Where did it? Azimuth began to speak as ship began to bark, calling out their name as if in response to the question. Part of the floor where Ben was laying across with his head in Gwen's lap then began to move around on its own. It had wrapped itself around Ben's wrist, repeating its name a couple of times, and Ben smiles, telling ship good boy. The first thinker growls in frustration and says that he will take it from them, though Ben says that he's welcome to try, as he activated the dial on the device when ship moved themselves away from Ben's wrist, revealing that they'd brought it to him. Ben then hits it down and changes into his Tetraman form, standing up slowly and grabbing his busted arm. He then begins to grunt in frustration and pain before popping his arm back into its proper place. Kevin says, that's just, wow. Okay, could you never do that in front of me again? That sounded painful. While Ben then responded that it was painful. He then changed into Swamp Fire, allowing his body to regenerate now that everything was where it should be, slowly healing up and preparing for the battle that's about to take place soon. Azimuth tells Ben that he truly has grown into becoming a great leader, and that he'd been keeping an eye on things ever since they'd first come to him on Xenon, and that he had learned from many different species of him and his reputation. You, Ben Tennyson, are a very dangerous individual. He'd added to that as Ben quirked an eyebrow looking at them. But I've come to learn that you are also a kind-hearted and caring young man, that the universe is lucky to have on their side. You may keep the Ultimatrix, for now. Nodding, Ben listened to what Azimuth had to say, and then asked him more about this Ultimatrix device, wanting to know what kind of new setup they were working with exactly. To which the first thinker, smartest being in 3, arguably 5 galaxies, then smirked, knowing that when they had to deal with Vilgax, this was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime event. Once they'd gotten to Earth, they found Vilgax's ship, and Ben asked Gwen if she could teleport them on board, to which she'd nodded in response. Ben tells ship to go get all of their parents and take them to the base until everything was safe and over with, to which the Mechamorph then barked in response, flying past the ship as Gwen teleported them all on board as Vilgax was about to fire, though he'd stopped seeing that they were aboard his ship and laughed. Vilgax then looked around at the group with a twisted sort of smile, asking if Tennyson was such a coward now that he'd lost the Omnitrix that he would send the others to do his bidding. Though the captain's chair, Vilgax's throne in his ship, slowly began began to turn as an all too familiar voice says, "Think again." As Ben came into view, smirking at them, ready for a rematch, the warlord's eyes went wide, seeing that he'd almost completely recovered from their earlier battle. While Vilgax was stunned seeing him there, Ben then jokingly says, "Hi honey, I'm home. Did you miss me?" With a smug look in his ever-confident face. He'd had one leg crossed with his foot sitting on the other leg atop his lap, and he had one arm resting beside him, and the other one sitting bent with the elbow up to his hand being upright and the back of his hand underneath his chin. He'd also had some sort of new device upon that hand. It started at the wrist and went halfway up his forearm. From the way he was sitting, it looked as though he'd already beaten Vilgax and the rest was just a formality. "You dare mock me, Tennyson?" Vilgax then questions angrily as Ben says that he'd mock anyone that used the word mock. While the tyrant grew angry and called for some of his bioids, making them surround the group while telling them to behold his army as he hit the Omnitrix dial, changing them all into Diamond Head. Ben fakes surprise and says, "That's not fair at all. Should probably do something about that, Azimuth," and moves his arm that had been resting beside him, holding up the Galvan First Thinker, who called out to the Omnitrix to activate voice command override, then tells it to activate self-destruct sequence 30 seconds. And the Omnitrix dial popped out with a bunch of flashing lights spinning and the Galvan symbols counting down from 30. Vilgax says that they are bluffing, but the group just stands there watching as the watch then exploded with Vilgax still attached, knocking him back towards the controls. Getting frustrated that the bioids were now useless, he then began typing in something on the controls and smashed it. The others had demanded to know what he had done, and the tyrant says that the ship would now crash into Bellwood. Kevin says they could reroute it with the backup controls, though Vilgax says that they must get through him first. Ben then stands up, cracking his knuckles, telling him that wouldn't be an issue. Vilgax then asked how exactly he intended to beat him without the Omnitrix, to which Ben says that he didn't need the Omnitrix, and hit down the dial, changing into Swamp Fire. The alien warlord was surprised seeing them able to transform once more and gets angry and goes to attack them, with Ben blasting him back with fire, telling him that he's already lost. Vilgax says that they haven't won yet, with the ship beginning to veer off course and rattle around. He demands to know what's going on, and Kevin asks if he'd forgotten something leaning against a wall. Looking around, the tyrant then questions where the blonde one and the Galvan had gone off to, as the voice of the First Thinker began to come over the speaker system, telling them that they'd borrowed the spacecraft backup controls to make sure that his little plan failed to take action, and that they'd be heading into what the humans called the Pacific Ocean soon. Ben tells Gwen to get Kevin and the others all out of there, and to leave Vilgax to him. He's got it, this time for sure. Nodding, Gwen and Kevin ran off to meet up with Lucy and Azimuth, then used a teleportation spell to get them out safely onto the ground. Breathing heavily, she'd lost her balance and dropped, though Lucy grabbed her before she could hit the ground and helped Gwen sit down on a bench nearby the water. Meanwhile, Ben was still fighting Vilgax. The alien warlord calls Ben a fool. With the ship taking on this much water, his fire powers will be useless. Our hero then smirks and says, "Maybe if this were the Omnitrix," and then hits the symbol on his chest, changing into ultimate swamp fire form, and blasted Vilgax backwards so hard that it busted a hole in the side of the ship. Vilgax transforms into a giant octopus-like creature and then goes after Ben, but he changes into Big Chill and freezes the water inside the ship before flying out of there and changing into Jet Ray, flying off to meet up with the others. Ben flies up out of the water and heads straight for home. He'd landed on a dock and looked around, changing back, seeing only his team was there. And so he'd headed on off with Vilgax's ship exploding off in the distance. He jokingly asked if anyone got the number of that truck, and Gwen runs over hugging him, glad to see that he was alright. Azimuth congratulated Ben on defeating Vilgax, telling him that he's done a lot of good here today, to which Ben nods and looks concerned, asking that if Vilgax didn't have the stolen Omnitrix core, who did? As we then cut to a cerebral crustacean that had a blue shell color laughing while walking into a laboratory of some kind.